Okay, so I am starting on page 182, and this section is about making pledges or oaths. Oh, and good morning, Campbells. So would somebody read, I'm on page 182, so either out of the book or out of a Bible, Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 through 37.
I'll read. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Susan.
Okay. You have heard that it was said, you have heard that it was said by the people of the old days, you shall not take an oath falsely, but you shall pay your oath in full to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is the throne of God, nor by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king, nor by your head, for you cannot take one hair black or white. When you say yes, let it be yes. And when you say no, let it be no. Anything which goes beyond that has its source in evil.
Okay, thank you. I made the statement as we wrapped up last week that, I had already prepared for this piece, and I didn't like it. And I think the reason I didn't like it was because I can't relate to it. I don't swear. I don't know that I've ever been in a position to formally take an oath. So I couldn't connect with this. Do any of y'all take oaths? I mean, do you have any personal experience with this particular passage? Okay.
Well, when you testify in court, you take an oath, and there are many political offices where you take an oath of office.
Okay.
All law enforcement people are sworn in when they begin their
When you get
service.
married, you take an oath.
The military.
When you get married.
Isn't the Pledge of Allegiance considered an oath? Isn't that why Jehovah's don't do it?
Could be.
That's very possible. Didn't think about that one.
Sarah,
I don't know. I'm just asking.
Sarah, I think you mentioned that you don't swear, and I think there's confusion between cussing and swearing, making a promise, if you will, to do something.
Well, no, this passage does make that distinction that when they talk about swearing here, they are talking about swearing an oath. They're not talking about cussing. No, I cuss.
Now, I have a question, and maybe Harold can chime in on this. Going back historically, when they were talking about this, were they talking about oaths in court or oaths in business? Like, I swear I'll pay you 3 goats for this piece of land. How exactly was it meant back then when it was written?
I feel sure it was any, not just in court, any everyday thing, because they didn't write down transactions. I mean, even as recently as 100 years ago, men shook hands over stuff. Michael told me yesterday that a man died in Powhatan whose land they've hunted for decades, and it was just a handshake. You can hunt our land, and the 2 sons now are going to sell the land. There was never even any written agreement. It was just a handshake.
Well, I can remember within the last 10 years, 10 or 11 years, I used to belong to a flying club, and I was trying to sell my share, and finally found somebody who agreed to buy my share at an agreed price, and we shook on it.
Yeah.
In a room. I mean, it was after the meeting, and it was a private conversation, but other members of the club witnessed it. Well, then somebody else, not knowing that we had made this deal, and there was nothing wrong with what this other member did, another member put his share up for sale about $1,000 or $1,500 less than what I was selling mine. And this guy heard about it, talked to the guy, came back to me and said, "Are you willing to lower your price?" And I said, "No, we've already shaken hands. We've got an agreement." And he backed out of our agreement and went and bought the cheaper share.
Oh, no.
And so when his membership came up to vote, the club voted to let him buy the share. And most people didn't know about it. The guy who was recording it had seen it, and he said, "Sarah, are you going to vote against this?" And I said, "No, but I will abstain for the record." And people are looking around like, "What's going on?" And we explained, and the guy who sold his share cheaper apologized. I said, "You didn't do anything wrong. This guy did. We shook on it. I thought we had a deal and he backed out.
It's called a gentleman's agreement.
Yeah. And this guy was foreign. So I'm wondering how much of it might have been cultural.
Possible.
Yeah. So anyway, but the book does talk about the situations, and apparently some people there would just say, I swear to you, the sky is blue. Well, they're making the point that you shouldn't swear so lightly. You know, obviously the sky is blue. So two things, don't swear lightly. And they would say, you know, I swear on my mother's grave. You know, we've all heard that expression. So not to do that. Let me turn my sound off here.
I used to do Girl Scouts honor.
Yeah.
Girl Scouts honor, I'm telling the truth.
Yeah. So so not to do that, not to swear lightly, but also excuse me, some reason don't have much of a voice today. Not to, that you should live a life that makes your life the oath, basically. That if people know you well enough to know that when you say something, that's what it means.
That
Really,
is the
yes.
truth.
A yes,
How many
indeed.
times Jesus said, truly I tell you, you know, I mean, he does that very frequently.
But is that a
I swear, I just think it's when you say no, when you say yes here. Well, it's, you know, he doesn't say Girl Scouts honor or I swear by Jerusalem or whatever. He just says, truly, I tell you, you know. So I don't think that's not, I don't consider that a swear.
And
Right,
who is that, Susan, that does that?
Jesus.
Oh, gotcha.
Why you just
Yeah.
said that, not true.
Now, remember from last time, we had two different schools of thought, the Shammai, who were very rigid, and the Hillels, who were lighter. They talk about here that the school of Shammai was so wedded to the truth that they forbade the ordinary courteous politeness of society. For example, when a bride was complimented for her charming appearance, when in fact she was not particularly attractive. So they didn't even believe in, you know, the little polite white lies that we sometimes tell to smooth our interactions with other people.
So tell the truth even if it hurts.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yes.
Hey, Cassie.
hello?
so by the time Jesus was talking about this, there were two unsatisfactory things about taking oaths. And the first one was called frivolous swearing, which is what I was just talking about, you know, swearing that the sky is blue. And then the second was what might be called evasive swearing. And the Jews divided oaths into two classes, those which were absolutely binding and those which were not. I thought that was kind of strange. If it's not binding, why are you swearing? And any oath that contained the name of God was absolutely binding. Any oath which succeeded in evading the name of God was held not to be binding. So, you know, if they swore by the name of God in any form, he was to rigidly keep the oath because the idea that was that God was part of the oath.
So swearing on the Bible then
Yeah.
is more effective.
Well,
than
they didn't have a Bible at that
that time,
point.
right? But I think how we transition to the modern day.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you didn't use God's name in the oath, then God wasn't part of it and you could break it. So here's the eternal truth. Life cannot be divided into compartments, in some of which God is involved and in others of which he is not involved. There cannot be one kind of language in the church and another kind of language in the shipyard or the factory or the office. There cannot be one kind of standard of conduct in the church and another kind of standard in the business world. The fact is that God does not need to be invited into certain departments of life and kept out of others. He is everywhere, all through life and every activity. He hears not only the words which are spoken in his name, he hears all words, and there cannot be any such thing as a form of words which evades bringing God into a transaction. So there.
Well, the last sentence, read the very last sentence on that page.
We will regard all promises as sacred if we remember that all promises are made in the presence of God.
Yep. I told, before both of my boys got married, I said, now I know you've dated these girls a long time, but I said, you are taking an oath in front of God. You are making a contract to honor, to love, to cherish, and all of that. And I said, do you mean all of that? Because you're going to say it in front of witnesses in a church, just like you're in court. A lot of people don't understand that, which I think that's why they so easily undo it. But I think what you do in a wedding ceremony is like an oath.
Yeah,
It's definitely a sacred agreement.
right. And I've heard Cindy talk about, back when, before people started doing destination and weird places for weddings, a lot of people from outside of the church community would come to Bon Air for their weddings. And Cindy said she had trouble reminding them or convincing them that it was a religious ceremony.
And that a church is a sacred space and the dog really can't bring the rings down the aisle.
Right.
She told me that story too. She
Yeah.
really had to convince this couple that their dog couldn't bring the rings down the aisle.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny when I was married to my first husband, we were married at Bon Air Christian. And when that crashed and burned, I finally took my wedding band off, but I made sure I took it off at church because that's where I put it on.
Oh, lovely symbolism.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that symbolism.
Yeah. And I don't think God intends for us to stay married when the circumstances aren't what you swore the oath to.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a little bit more on oaths. The passage concludes with a commandment that when people have to say yes, they should say yes and no should be no. The ideal is that we should never need an oath, but then Barclay talks about, well, what about when you're in court? Does this saying of Jesus forbid the taking of an oath anywhere? And there are two sets of people who refuse to ever take an oath. And one set back in Jesus's day was the Essenes. And they were well-known and just, led a super religious life. But today, and I didn't know this, Quakers will not take an oath.
Don't you have to take an oath to enter the military?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And so the Quakers try to do some other job, like not carrying a gun, like conscientious objectors do.
yeah.
You
Yeah,
can work
they'll
in
do
the
public-
warehouse or do something
Yeah,
else.
they'll do public service.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's upholding the Constitution of the United States of America.
Say that again, Bud?
Not about holding a gun, it's about upholding the Constitution of the
Yeah.
United States of America. That's what you're swearing to.
But it's an oath, right?
It is an oath, and they can be a conscientious objector, or I don't know how it works, not shooting a gun or whatever, but that's what it's about.
Does anyone know what the Essenes became? Did they become, are they a sect of Orthodox Jews today, or did they die out?
I think they died out. I'll try to remember to do some research this week.
I'm
'Cause
just curious if they were able to maintain that style of living for any length of time. I fall short hourly. Would be really admirable if they could.
I really like it that just say yes or say no is just basically telling you, rather than having to take an oath for someone to think that you're not going to do, not going to tell a lie in court or whatever, the oath shouldn't be necessary.
right.
You should say yes, then you should be telling the truth.
Right.
Yeah. And Barclay finishes, or a little bit later, he says, if it is necessary to take an oath from someone, the necessity arises from the evil that is in the individual. If there's no evil in that person, the oath would not be necessary.
But he does spend a little time on page 186 talking about both Paul and Jesus not protesting being put on oath, having
Yeah.
to take an oath. So
Yes.
both Paul and Jesus, because doesn't I don't forget if it's Pontius Pilate or Herod, asked
Yeah.
Jesus to swear that you're the Son of God or whatever.
Yeah, but I think his reply was, "You say so." I don't think he swore at that point. He turned it back on them. But then
Right.
Barclay, the next section, and I'm at the bottom of 186, the fact that it is necessary to put people on oath on certain occasions arises from the fact that this is an evil world. And in a perfect world, we could get away without oaths, but this is not a perfect world. And so that fact is reflected in some circumstances that we need to take an oath or get an oath from somebody else. So the last paragraph of this section. So this saying of Jesus leaves two obligations upon us. It leaves upon us the obligation to make ourselves such that others will see our transparent goodness, that they will never ask an oath from us. And it leaves upon us the obligation to seek to make this world such a world that falsehood and infidelity will be so eliminated from it that the necessity for oaths will be abolished. And that's a heavy obligation.
I guess you do an oath when I've been on a jury, and I've had to swear, when kids at school do stuff, and I would have to go to court to testify for kids or against kids. The people in the courtroom don't know you, so you do the oath there.
Yeah.
Because they don't know you or your character. Although they should assume if you're a principal in a high school, you can be trusted, but that isn't always the case.
Right. And I think that's being a witness. I served on a jury and I don't remember taking an oath for jury duty. I may have, but
Yeah.
I don't remember doing it.
I just got my paperwork to do that again. Woohoo.
I don't know how this kind of translates to our contemporary times, but I think in Jesus' time, I know there were fairly large communities, but quite often it was just a hamlet, if you will, or some kind of a thing, and everybody knew everybody. And
Right.
you know that if Joe was honest and said he was going to do something, he would do it. But we've all taken an oath when we turn this computer on. I agree. Whatever it is, we have to say, I agree. We have gotten to the point where we don't know who we're agreeing with, and they're halfway around the world, and we're making agreements to.
And the
to do
agreement is in
yeah,
5-point type, this
52
long.
pages.
We don't even
of
read
stuff,
it.
because part of it can be changed at any time. So that's an extreme example in a way.
Yeah, Cassie, I've tried to read it. I'll read.
Well, it's just,
Yeah.
I don't
Well,
want
you
to
make an
go on
excellent
a tight tangent, but if all this stuff, if we live the way Jesus is teaching us, we wouldn't need a whole lot of lawyers.
Yeah.
The sad thing is, in court now, people are finding that it's very hard to convict somebody on the testimony of a witness. And juries, if they don't have physical evidence, DNA, fingerprints, what have you, it's the word of the average person doesn't seem to cut the mustard anymore. And I think that's really sad.
Well, a lot of times when I've been on jury duty and hear people telling about something, I think about when someone walks by me in the street, and then if they went up the street and did something like a hit and run or whatever, I couldn't describe what they look like. And yet some people feel so assured that they are describing, yes, that's that person, kind of a thing. So sometimes it's very hard with just a witness to know that the witness saw what they think they saw.
So I think trying to get this back to the class and the teachings there, the only thing I can think to do is to try to make my word be my bond, and all this other nonsense of I agree and lawyers and everything else, that just has to play out however it does.
Sarah, I'm sorry, I came in a little late, but could you explain again the difference between the Hillels and the Essenes? The Essenes were.
Well, no, I wasn't comparing the Hillels and the Essenes. I was comparing the Hillels to the Shemais.
Oh, okay.
And the Shemais were very, very strict about how they interpreted things. And we did this last week with divorce. And when we talked about it last week, the law said that a man could divorce his wife if she was, what was the word? Displeasing. And the Shammai said the only way she could be displeasing was if she was unfaithful. The Hillel said she could be displeasing if she burns your dinner. So that they had a much looser translation of or interpretation of the law. And then the Essenes were just their own different thing. I'll try to, I've got a great course on Jewish history, and she does one lecture on Essenes. So I'll go back and look at that and report next week.
Cool.
Well, what I think also that you can get, I don't know if this lesson is trying to, how much it's trying to delve into truthfulness, but you know, you started off by talking about white lies, and but they're even, I think back to Corrie ten Boom's book,
Hiding place.
yes,
Yeah.
and so she was part of the Dutch resistance during World War II, and her family hid Jewish people from the Nazis. And one of the scenes that always sticks in my mind is Corrie ten Boom's brother and sister-in-law lived in another house, and they had 3 or 4 children, and they were also hiding Jews. And but they had this very, it was based on their Christian belief that you absolutely cannot lie. And so where they were hiding the Jewish people, they had a kitchen table, and underneath the kitchen table there was a rug, and the rug was over top of a trap door, and they were hiding the Jewish people under in the, you know, the crawl space under that trap door. And you know, one day the Nazis come in, and they think that maybe they're and they what did they said, do you have any Jewish people in your house, or something like that? And the woman replies with her 3 or 4 little children at her feet. She says, of course, they're right under the kitchen table, you know. And I mean, she said, she delivered in a way that it sounded sarcastic, and the Nazis looked, and of course, you know, they don't see any Jewish people under the kitchen table. But you know, I think, and so the reason I'm sharing that story is there is a very moral argument to lie in some cases. I mean, she managed to keep her prohibition on lying by making it sound sarcastic. But there would be cases where I think it would be
Yes.
permissible to lie. If you're,
Yes, I agree. And that's a perfect situation for it.
Mhm.
Stay over there.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, unless anybody has any further comments on swearing and taking oaths, I'm going to move to the next section. Okay. Would somebody like to read verses 38 through 42?
On page 187.
Yeah. Okay, I'll do it.
I'll read it again.
Okay.
You have heard that it has been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist evil. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. And if anyone wishes to obtain judgment against you for your tunic, give him your cloak also. And if anyone impresses you into the public service to go a mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to him who asks you, and do not turn away from him who wishes to borrow from you.
Okay, there's a lot in this passage. Barclay makes the point that few passages in the New Testament have more of the essence of the Christian ethic in them than this one. Even people who don't know much about Christianity know about this passage. So let's talk about the first part where he talks about if I'm going to start with if anybody strikes you on the right cheek, because this I thought this was very interesting. If you're standing in front of somebody, and figure most people are right-handed, I know I've got some lefties here, but if somebody's right-handed, how are they going to strike you on your right cheek?
Yeah.
You can't, the only way to do it if they're right-handed is to backhand you.
Behind you.
There's one in every class. Okay, assuming we are facing you, the only way they're going to do it is to backhand you. And in that culture, to be slapped backhanded was much more of an insult than to be slapped with an open palm. And I did not realize that until I read this section here.
Backhanded remark.
Backhanded remark, Bud said.
Oh,
Ooh.
Mm-hmm.
excellent comment. So, so anyway, it was never taken literally, but, and we see this as being very harsh, but actually this goes back to the Code of Hammurabi. And it was to put a limit on vengeance, because at that time in the world, if, let's say a man from village A kills a man from village B, the entire population of village B is going to come take vengeance on the entire population of village A. It's not just, so vengeance was, and retaliation was way out of proportion to say, okay, an eye for an eye, put a lid on it and made it more equitable. And it depended on whether you were in the upper class or the lower class as to how that was supposed to be divvied up. If a man has caused the loss of a gentleman's eye, his eye one shall be caused to be lost. If he shattered a gentleman's limb, he shall shatter his limb. But if you've done it to a poor man, you could just pay whatever. And what they did was figure out if this was a slave, how much has this injury lowered the value of the slave? And that's how you figured out what to pay. And they said part of that is, another reason to not do this literally is if we say an eye for an eye, suppose you have injured what was already a bad eye, should somebody give up a good eye for a bad eye? No, that's not equitable. So they came up with financial payments for all of this. So the Latin term for it was lex talionis, the law of tit for tat. So instead of being savage and bloodthirsty, it's actually the beginning of mercy to limit vengeance, like I talked about. Further, this was never a law to give a private individual the right to extract vengeance. So this was kind of an eye-opener to me too. This was always a law which laid down how a judge in a law court would assess punishment and penalty. So you didn't get to go figure out what your vengeance would be. This law was for judges.
What you
You
said
know-
there makes me think that there were two ways to go about it. Gentlemen could have some kind of agreement or fight or whatever, but the lower class, the slaves, you said, became a monetary agreement. And if you think about that, the person that got paid for their damage was not the slave, it was the slave owner. And so it would be the equivalent of you tearing up my car and now it's only worth half of its value. And so I get compensated for that. The car didn't get compensated.
Right. Yeah. good
You know,
point.
we all hear on TV all the time about there was a man in Richmond years ago who got cheated in a card game and he stood up and shot the guy across the table and it was his nephew over a cheating in a card game. And road rage, where people run cars off the road because they don't let them merge at a ramp and they end up killing two parents and two kids over a merging incident. I mean, just incredible disproportion.
I had a student at Virginia Union, and he was at his girlfriend's house, and somebody, and this is in the middle of the day, somebody was breaking into her car parked out on the street, and he took a gun and went out to chase the guy away and shot him in the back as he ran away from the car. Killed him, ended up in jail.
Oh,
And they
yeah.
said, you don't use lethal force to protect property.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And
You
so,
can't, even
yeah.
if somebody's running away, we had to take law classes to be a principal. Even if somebody's running away from the school with school property, you can't injure them over property. I
right,
mean, if they've picked up a kid and they're kidnapping their kid, but they're not the parent that has custody, you can do something. But, and we've had those issues where people come in school and try to take, they're the non-custodial parent. That's a nightmare to keep up with. But yeah, you can't shoot people leaving your house with your TV. Now, if they're leaving with your kid, but not your TV.
yeah,
I was at a summer bagpipe class, and this guy was from West Virginia, and his philosophy was if you shoot him, then you drag him back inside over the doorstep.
That's what
Yeah.
my dad used to say, shoot them and drag them back in. Yeah.
yeah. But then Nancy would tell you that you need to make sure the evidence doesn't indicate that that's what happened. You got to make it look good.
Right. Like there's no trail of blood from your front porch to, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. The third item here is that this law was never, at least in any semi-civilized society, carried out literally. The Jewish jurist argued rightly that to carry it out literally might in fact be the reverse of justice, because it could displace a good eye or a good tooth for a bad eye. If a man has injured another, now this sounded a whole lot like today, and Barclay even made that comment, but if a man has injured another, he's liable on 5 counts: pain, injury, healing, loss of time, and for indignities suffered. In regard to injury, he is looked on as a slave and looked at the value before or after. So it's not literally that he was a slave, but if he were, how would his value have been changed? If he, in regard to pain, it was estimated how much money he would accept to be willing to undergo the pain. In regard to healing, the injurer had to pay all the expenses of necessary medical attention until a complete cure had been effected. In regard to loss of time, the injurer had to pay compensation for wages lost while he couldn't work, and also had to pay compensation for the level of job that he had, not just to pay, to keep food on the table, but to compensate him for his income. And in regard to indignity, the injurer had to pay damages for humiliation and indignity. So that sounds a whole lot like today's law.
Well, when people that are convicted wrongly get out of prison, they give them the amount they would have reasonably earned in whatever job they were doing or could have done. That times the number of years they were incarcerated, and that's what the state has to pay them. So if they were a plumber, they get the average plumber rate per hour, per day, per year times the number of years they were locked up, and that's what the state has to pay a wrongly convicted inmate.
Yeah.
I read that in the newspaper somewhere years ago.
Yeah. Most important of all, it must be remembered that lex talionis is by no means the whole of Old Testament. There are glimpses and even splendors of mercy. Leviticus 19:18 says, "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge. If your enemies are hungry, give them bread. If they're thirsty, give them water to drink." So I marked this particular passage that it was critical. But Jesus obliterated the very principle of this law, because retaliation, however controlled and restricted, has no place in the Christian life.
You know, we treated German prisoners of war so well over here that many of them immigrated. They were being treated better here as prisoners than they were as soldiers in Germany. They had more food, more shelter. Many of them immigrated. I've read a couple of books of biographies about people who immigrated to the US because it was such a great place to live while they were prisoners of war.
We've regressed a bit since then. I think about the way we treated families on the southern border. Horrifying that was when we were taking children from their parents. and
I'm
putting-
absolutely shocked that the records weren't good enough that they can't reunite. I read an article just this
Oh.
week. They're really struggling to
I
find
know.
someone to reunite these kids with, and surely they got some basic information, but evidently not, or they can't match them up.
I can't match them.
That seems
No.
ridiculous. And it's like 580 some kids they're trying to match back to family members.
No, there was no information taken. They just moved them through and didn't do any record keeping. And having worked in those kinds of situations with, emergency removals of kids from families and stuff, it's a very high stress situation and you've got to be really structured and organized. And if you're not, it's chaos.
But they showed tables where they were typing and interviewing and people who were there doing charity work. They were advocates for them, and they showed them at tables in a big room with laptops taking information, but that must not have been for everyone.
I doubt that it was.
Many of the parents did not give their real names.
There was-
Ah,
Some of that too, but I think also that some of the organization just wasn't there.
wow.
So it was a very complicated situation, multiple factors, no one issue.
Right.
You've
Wow.
got some families that they would rather give up their kids and for the kids to stay here in this country than to be sent back to the countries that they came from. And so they won't step forward to claim the children.
Oh,
Interesting.
that's another angle.
Yeah, that
Mhm.
is another angle.
Yeah,
Thank you, Stuart.
that does make sense.
It does.
Yeah.
Okay,
They came from some very scary situations.
yeah, they did. So for Christians, Jesus abolishes the old law of limited vengeance and introduces the new spirit of non-resentment and non-retaliation. He goes on to take 3 examples of the Christian spirit in operation. So to take these with crude literalism is completely to miss their point. So we're going to talk about, if you someone smites you on the right cheek, we must turn the other cheek. And that's where Barclay talks about you've been backhanded, which is more insulting. So what Jesus is saying is, even if someone should direct at you the most deadly and calculated insult, you must on no account retaliate, and you must on no account resent it. So not only do you not retaliate, you don't resent it.
That's where it
That's
gets
the hard
really
part.
tough.
Yeah. It will not happen very often, and if at all, then anyone will slap us on the face. But time and again, life brings to us to insults, either great or small. And Jesus is saying here that the true Christian has learned to resent no insult and to seek retaliation for no slight. So I'm thinking about this and a situation where I felt very insulted and so I was trying to figure out if I was insulted or indignant or if there was a difference. It's when I was in the PhD program at VCU, and it was a brand new program. And I was part of a group that started the original PhD business student organization. I was secretary. I was the only girl, so I was the secretary. Well, there was a foreign guy who came to some of our meetings and he wanted to be involved in what we were doing. And we're sitting around a round table in a restaurant somewhere, and he has a legal pad. And he gives the legal pad to the guy next to him and says, write down your name and address and phone number. And this was before email. then rather than saying pass the pad around the table, he takes the pad back and hands it to the next guy, takes it back, hands it to the next guy, takes it back, skips me, because I'm a woman, he's from the Middle East, and hands it around. So he doesn't get my information and doesn't give me his. And he's walking around a week or two later saying, I'm not hearing from you. Why are y'all not? And I don't think the guys figured it out, but I'm sitting there going, I'm the secretary. I didn't say this out loud, but in my head, I'm thinking, you've insulted me. I'm not going to reach out to you because I'm insulted. And then I kind of took that a step further going, well, this is how women were treated before they got the vote. And how did women get the vote unless it was reacting to a systemic insult? So that's where my head was this morning before class. So I throw that out to y'all to talk about.
Yeah, that's a great example.
I think that one of the first things I thought of when I was hearing that passage is, when do you take action then? Do you never take action? And if you never take action, nothing will ever change.
Right.
Right. I mean, because I struggle with this a bit too. And I think about a man I used to work with who was deeply, deeply religious, and very, very dear guy. I really, really like him. But he does at times become a doormat because he just won't ever stand up, and I think he takes this turn the other cheek very literally, and so he doesn't ever stand up. And I don't know.
I think if we try to take a look at when did Jesus, take action, when he was in the temple, he took action.
Yeah, he did.
He made his point known. He just didn't ignore that this kind of thing was happening there. And it was because it had to do with the Holy Temple and with God and disrespect to God. And maybe not disrespect him personally, but it's because I have to think that you have to take a stand at some point.
I think it matters who it is. If it's someone I'm not a distant relative, I'm going to see once a year at a reunion. If it's someone I'm on a trip somewhere and I'm never going to see them again, it's much easier to let that go. It's not worth the effort. But if it's someone I'm going to interact with regularly, and I feel offended, I usually set up a time to meet and say, hey, let's meet and talk about this. I think it depends on the circumstances for me.
What I'm thinking about is, does this mean perhaps not to take an emotional reaction in terms of when, Pilate was, just berating Jesus and treating him badly, and Jesus did not comment back, did not retaliate, yet it didn't change his behavior. Jesus knew he had to go to the Father, and it did not change his course of action. He simply didn't react emotionally to what was happening at the moment.
Good point.
I find it's a whole lot easier to deal with insults and injuries to myself than it is to watch them happen to somebody else, because that hell flies in me when I see that happen.
Yeah, I'd like to see that.
I wouldn't.
I want to be at a safe distance. So the next piece goes on where Jesus talks about if somebody tries to take your tunic, also give them your cloak. So Barclay describes that a tunic is a long sack-like inner garment made of cotton or linen, and even the poorest man would have had a change of tunics. but that many people only had one cloak, and the cloak was also used as their blanket at night. And so that's why it was actually part of the Jewish law that a man's tunic might be taken as a pledge, but not his cloak. If you take your neighbor's cloak in pawn, you shall restore it before the sun goes down, because it may be your neighbor's only clothing to use as cover. So what Jesus is saying is this: Christians never demand rights. And that's kind of where I had an issue. They never dispute about their legal rights. They do not consider themselves to have any legal rights at all. There are people who are forever demanding their rights, clutch their privileges, and he goes on about it. But Barclay says that Jesus is saying Christians just don't worry about their rights. And I have trouble with that one. Third item.
Sarah, I wonder if that's like, and I don't know enough about it, but I wonder if, like the Amish, for example, you know, if that might be where they land, because I don't know that they don't go into courts of justice. And I remember years ago reading about an Amish buggy that was carrying a family of 12, and a drunk driver hit the buggy and killed both parents and several of the children. And the Amish community adopted the remaining children who survived the wreck, and never prosecuted the drunk driver. They would not appear in court. They would not prosecute him. So, and that's always kind of stuck with me, you know, like they just, is that because of the way they're interpreting that passage?
Yeah.
I wonder if they think that man's going to live a horrible life because of what he did. He's going to reap his own negative reward. And why should they go to court and ruin yet another life? It's already ruined, and God will judge one day. So they're going to get judgment. God's going to do it.
Yeah. The third point here is Jesus goes on to speak of being compelled to go 1 mile. It says, in such a case, Christians must willingly go 2 miles. There's a picture here of which we know little for it. It's a picture from an occupied country. The word used to compel is agaruin, and it comes from a Persian word which means a courier. And the Persians had an amazing postal service, and he describes that. And basically, what it means is that individuals can be pressed into service, compelled into service, or giving food. And in the end, the word came to signify any kind of forced or pressured call to the service of the occupying power. In an occupied country, citizens could be compelled to supply food, to provide lodging, to carry baggage. Sometimes the occupying power exercised this right of compulsion in the most tyrannical, unsympathetic way. And this is actually the word that was used when Simon of Cyrene was compelled to carry the cross of Jesus. So what Jesus is saying is this: suppose your masters come to you and compel you to be a guide or a porter for a mile. Don't do a mile with a bitter, obvious resentment. Go 2 miles with cheerfulness and good grace. Don't always be thinking of your liberty to do as you like. Be always thinking of your duty and your privilege to be service to others. When a
Don't
task
we have, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, one more sentence and you can talk. When a task is laid on you, even if the task is unreasonable and hateful, don't do it as a grim duty to be resented. Do it as a service to be gladly rendered.
Don't we have an amendment or something in the Constitution that because the British could commandeer your horses, your cows, your pigs, they could eat your food, you know, if they were staying in your town? Don't we have something against that, an amendment or something, that the government cannot take your property without justly compensating you, that's based on this principle?
It's very possible.
The occupying force can't come and take your cow for milk or your pigs and chickens for food without compensating you, because the British did it to the colonists.
Yeah, I think it's very possible. And it reminds me of eminent domain. And you're right, you do have to be compensated. Now, whether or not you consider it reasonable, is up for question. I had a friend in high school, and when they were building 295 through Henrico, her parents' farm was cut into 3 pieces. Yeah, pretty much made it useless. And they went to court because the compensation they received, they did not consider reasonable, but they were compensated.
Yeah, there's a lady in Virginia Beach. There's an ongoing battle. It's in the paper. I read about it every few months. She's trying to prevent them from taking her property. I forget if it's for a road or a subdivision or whatever. And she probably will ultimately lose, but it's her family farm as well, and they're taking a chunk of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I was a teenager and the Smith Mountain Dam was going to be built, that was taking farms that had been in generations
Yeah.
and deciding the value of those was quite a struggle for the courts.
Yeah.
Same thing with the Blue Ridge Parkway. They took poor land from Scottish and Irish immigrants up in the mountains and paid them little or nothing for it to
Yeah.
build the Blue Ridge Parkway.
Okay, we're running out of time. So let me read one last little bit, and I actually will have finished most of that. Jesus is laying down 3 great rules. Christians will never resent or seek retaliation for any insult, however calculated and however deadly. Christians will never stand upon their legal rights or any other rights they may believe themselves to possess. Christians will never think of their right to do as they like, but always of their duty to be of help. Question is, how do we measure up?
That was the awesome.
Not too good.
Nope.
Yeah. Okay, we've got about 6 minutes to get to worship. So y'all have a good week.